You're listening to Beezy Beez Sleep Stories, created for the restless, the curious, and those who find themselves wide awake when the world goes quiet. To listen to more stories like this one, please visit deepbearsleep.com. Tonight's story, Subtle Threads. Let's begin. Evelyn Mercer lived her life like someone who had learned to read the small print. Carefully, by habit, eyes narrowed to catch the unexpected clause. She had been a nurse, then a hospital administrator, then an accidental gardener in a narrow city backyard that smelled of damp earth and chamomile. At 52, she kept lists in a leather notebook, measured the days in appointments and phone calls, and habitually checked the locks twice before bed. She liked certainty because certainty made the future manageable. What she did not expect was the way the world began to rearrange itself around questions she hadn't known she was asking. It started at the bus stop in late October. The street was the brittle kind of gray that seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn stood waiting and thought, without thinking, about a phrase from her mother's voice that had visited her lately. The place between knowing and remembering. The words had no origin she could place. She was not a religious woman in any organized sense. She had no cultish devotion to aphorisms. Yet the phrase had the texture of a thing she had misplaced and now half recognized in her pocket. An old woman sat next to her on the bench, a shawl like a map around her shoulders. She smelled faintly of peppermint and the kind of lemon cleaner that called itself house perfume. She pulled an apple from a paper bag, offered it casually. "You look like you could use a slice," she said. Evelyn accepted. They began to talk about small things, the temperature, the bus schedule, until the woman's eyes slid to Evelyn's hands, to the faint scar near her knuckle where she'd once sliced her palm making jam. "You keep things tidy," the woman observed, "but there are threads you pull by accident and threads you follow on purpose." Evelyn almost laughed but didn't. "Threads?" she echoed. The woman tapped the bench. "Subtle ones. They tug. You ignore them, or you follow. It makes a difference." When the bus came, the woman rose and left without giving her name. Evelyn turned the apple seed between her fingers and, later that day, wrote the phrase in her leather notebook. She forgot it for a week, then remembered it like a small ache. The second thread was a receipt. It seems prosaic to say it, how something so dull could tilt a life, but the receipt mattered because it came with a question. At the cafe by the clinic, Evelyn bought tea and a lemon tart. On the back of the receipt, someone had written, in a hurried hand, "Ask the question you think is impossible." There was no signature. She tucked the paper into her notebook and told herself she had been the recipient of some baker's joke. That evening, she lay awake and felt, absurdly, like a child about to ask for a secret. What was the impossible question? When she permitted herself to think of it, the question that rose was a simple, terrifying thing. What if I am more than what I have been counting? She had planned a comfortable rest of life, work until retirement, volunteer on Thursdays, see her son on holidays. But the impossible question tasted like a dare. She started to notice coincidences the way people notice the weather, because they have to. A former patient's daughter called and mentioned a book about dreams she found helpful. A neighbor's dog led her to a community center where a poster advertised a talk on maps you carry in your bones. A stranger in the elevator told a story about a woman who'd found a life path by following a single, unremarkable instinct. These were small things, not miracles, only invitations. Evelyn began to accept them like hints in a conversation she was learning to listen to. When she followed the dog to the community center, she met Isaac, a retired potter with ink-stained fingers and a laugh that arrived like relief. He taught a class on clay and metaphor that was half craft, half encouragement. He would hand Evelyn a lump of earth and say, "The thing about clay, about life, is you can see its seams if you look. You can mend them, or you can make something that lets the seam be part of the shape." She learned to watch seams. A week later, Evelyn received an email from a woman she had known decades ago in nursing school, Mara, who had vanished from her life right after graduation. Mara's message was spare. "Coffee? I'm back in town." They met in a cafe that smelled of espresso and orange peels. Mara had the same crooked smile, and now a quiet brand of sadness that had smoothed into clarity. "I was looking for something I'd misplaced," she said without preamble, "and I think I forgot how to ask for help." Mara became a mirror. Where Evelyn had learned to manage and contain, Mara had learned to risk and surrender. Their conversations braided, about grief, about the graceful lies adults tell themselves, about the small stubborn hope that still looked like stubbornness. It was with Mara that Evelyn said the impossible question out loud. "What if I am more than what I have been counting?" Mara laughed, which felt like an answer and not an answer. "Then maybe you were supposed to be counted differently," she said. The threads tugged at different speeds. Some were so slow Evelyn thanked herself for her patience. Some came like sharp pulls that demanded immediate decisions. The tug that would change everything arrived on a rainy Tuesday. Evelyn had been invited to speak at a workshop about bedside care, a thing she did professionally and well. At the end of the afternoon, a woman in the back raised her hand. She introduced herself as Dr. Lila Park, a cognitive scientist researching consciousness and ritual. She asked questions Evelyn had not prepared for, about the meaning of patient presence, about how people know when a life is done. When Evelyn answered, she talked not as an administrator, but as a person who had sat hour after hour with the dying and had learned to listen beneath the noise. She spoke about a patient who had said in a small voice, "I remember more than I can say." She said aloud to the room and herself, "There's a seam between knowing and remembering we all cross without instructions. Perhaps there's an all-knowing that hums behind it." After the workshop, Lila approached. "Have you ever considered that memory and knowledge are different keys to the same door?" she asked. She produced a small card and handed it to Evelyn. On it was written a single phrase: "We agreed to forget." That night, Evelyn felt like a seam that had been pried open. The idea that before birth, everyone made an agreement to forget a larger knowing so life would be lived with discovery fell over her like a soft rain and then settled. It explained everything it did not logically explain. Déjà vu, the unbidden answers that arrived in the right moment, the way grief and joy could teach the same lesson in different uniforms. She began to test the notion. Not in a laboratory way, but in the way you test a recipe by making it twice. She asked small things and paid attention to the answers that arrived not by force but by arrangement. A phone call, a book at the library, a shopkeeper's remark. Sometimes the universe answered with silence. Sometimes it answered with a doorway, opened by a person who seemed placed rather than random. Climax is a word that can feel like a drum roll, but Evelyn's climax was quieter, a slow tightening that demanded a choice. Her son, Daniel, called to say he needed to move across the country for a job, and asked whether she would consider selling the house and moving closer to him. The practical side of her argued for stability, for rootedness, for the garden that finally bloomed in gentle generosity. The new, tugged side, the side that listened for subtle threads, felt the pull toward something else. A fellowship Lila had mentioned, a communal house in the country working with elders on storytelling and memory practices. It was risky. It was perhaps an indulgence for someone of her age. That night, Evelyn lay awake and listened to the seam between knowing and remembering. She remembered an image from childhood, a sky full of threads, children of the world tugging on some invisible loom. She remembered, too, her mother's voice, and the small fear that to step away from the life one had built was to betray the person she had been. The decision arrived in the morning like an unexpected guest. She walked to the river where the water moved as if each ripple had its own agenda. A boy fed pigeons and the birds scattered like tiny maps. A woman, someone Evelyn had never seen, asked if she could sit. They talked about trivialities until the woman said, "My sister needed a nurse who could read stories." She was told to ask an Evelyn. She called me yesterday and I thought, maybe. Her voice trembled. She had been looking for a caregiver for a house of elders in the hills, someone who could both tend and listen. Evelyn felt the tug, all the threads, bus bench, receipt, Clay, Mara, Lila, the card with its terse phrase, seemed suddenly to converge on that small, trembling ask. She said yes. When she arrived at the house months later, with a single suitcase and a notebook full of questions, the elders greeted her like someone who had come home to a place she had always belonged to in potential. The house smelled of wood smoke and lavender. The days were full of slow rituals, tea leaves read like constellations, the telling of names of the old country, the mapping of dreams onto old quilts. They spoke as if remembering had muscle memory. Call it back and it responded. And sometimes, often, a question would be asked aloud in the kitchen or on the porch, and small, uncanny answers would arrive. The exact book they needed placed on the table, an old friend turning up at just the right moment, a poem that seemed to have been stitched for them the night before. Evelyn learned to recognize the difference between coincidence and the deliberate shape of something larger. The all-knowing, she named it various things depending on the day. Universe, divine spirit, the thing the elders simply called the thread, was not an entity that answered like a customer service line. It was a seamstress, a weather, a memory made active. It made arrangements. It nudged with precision that sometimes felt like luck and sometimes like intention. The end of the story is never tidy, because life rarely gives curtains and bows. But there was a close. One evening, under a sky the color of half-remembered dreams, Evelyn sat surrounded by people who had once been strangers and had become keepers of each other's histories. A young volunteer asked her, plainly, whether she had found what she was looking for. Evelyn thought of the bus bench, of the lemon tart receipt, of Mara's laughter and Lila's card. She thought of the seam between knowing and remembering, of the agreement to forget and the miracle of rediscovery. She thought of the quiet, ordinary miracles that make up a life, the right book on the right day, a hand that takes yours when the wind catches the door, the exact answer that shows up like a person at the right party. I found something like a home, she said, and something like a map. But the thing I keep finding is that the map was in me all along. We forget it, maybe because the story needs to be told. Maybe so we can practice asking the impossible question. The volunteer smiled. "And what is it?" she asked. Evelyn's eyes softened. "That we are more than we count, that there is an all-knowing, call it God, call it universe, call it thread, that listens when we dare to ask. And maybe, before we were born, we all agreed to forget it so that we would learn to remember." She could see the breath leave the volunteer's chest, a small astonishment. The house hummed, a chorus of kettles and distant laughter, and the soft thrum of a world that had decided to keep giving itself away. Evelyn did not claim to know everything. Some days the threads were quiet and answerless. Some nights the seam between remembering and knowing felt like the narrow edge of a map. But she had learned the shape of listening, and she had learned the courage of the small yes. In the years that followed, people came to the house with questions tucked into their pockets. Evelyn would hear them, tuck their questions into her own notebook, and sometimes, as if by arrangement, an apple would appear, or a receipt with a curious note, or a stranger with a memory that fit like a missing puzzle piece. She would say nothing grand. She would hand them tea and a pen and a small map, her leather notebook, inked with a single sentence on the first page. "We forgot, so we could learn to remember. Pull gently. The threads answer when you ask." And when she closed that notebook at night, she felt a vast, gentle pull in her chest. Not a burden, a connection, a humming as if the universe itself were a loom, and each tiny tug was a promise. We are here, waiting for the question.